5G has been a hot topic for years, but 2020 will be the year we begin to see 5G come to consumer devices at scale and become a force for digital transformation in the enterprise. These next generation mobile networks will push forward the evolution of technologies like autonomous vehicles, IoT, edge computing, data analytics, and smart cities. I spoke with Bettina Trotz-Ryan, VP Analyst with Gartner, about how 5G will affect smart city technology and change how cities will engage with residents and visitors. I started our conversation by asking her to define exactly what she means when she talks about smart cities.
And this is a very, very important question because smart city in its essence really means a much more technology and data-driven definition in a way that local governments or urban districts have been implementing smart traffic lighting or smart technology. But if you look into smart cities today, many of smart city leaders today want to actually create an environment that is actually engaging with citizens with a greater ecosystem around services, ambience, sustainability, even inclusion and equity. So the smart city definition of today for many cities actually go beyond technology and encompass the service experience. And that's becoming important when we talk about 5G.
Next, I asked Bettina how she saw 5G affecting smart cities in the near term. Think 1 to 3 years.
Yeah. So given that we look into the smart city experience from the way we as users, citizens, industries are actually experience our environment, the 5G from a bandwidth, from a processing perspective becomes important when there's a lot of data and analytics that we need to process and transfer at the experience level. But if you look today, a lot of the services, parking meters, lighting systems, they don't need the high bandwidth. They may need it in the future when we have autonomous systems or cars, sensors connecting to connected cars and smart buildings. But right now, I would say, quite honestly, in the next 1 to 3 years, you will be hard-pressed to find a good service model that actually would require 5G.
I followed up by asking Bettina what smart city technologies she sees benefiting from 5G in the longer term.
So there's an interesting trend that we see developing. And when you look in the smart city, we actually in Gartner like to call it also intelligent urban ecosystem. We start to look into not just the government engagement with citizens, but also all the private sector stakeholders, like the vehicle manufacturers, the real estate development, the construction companies, the life science and leisure companies, tourism. If you start to connect to a smartphone, all these data streams and experiences together, and you look for a maybe semi-autonomous car to look for the right parking, close to a museum for an elderly person that doesn't speak the language, so you see how that processing comes together, then 5G might as well be a very good venue to actually allow that technology and that process to apply a very good service experience for that elderly person. So we have cities that from a location perspective in smart streets or smart districts are starting to develop strategies to a smart post, for instance, where you have multiple sensors for security, sustainability, air quality, but then also crowd management, parking, waste management, and so on. If you connect this all together and you create a location bucket, then you actually have the requirement for high bandwidth and maybe on the edge computing. And cities like Toronto with the Google Sidewalk Labs, or in London with the data store, these are cities that are considering it.
As someone who is always talking with city leaders, agency heads, and private companies, I also asked Bettina to share her insights on how decision makers are looking at 5G and which use cases they think make the most sense.
So they're looking basically at some of the changes that are occurring with respect to demographic development. So there is a change of how we're going to construct roads and buildings because of, let's say, climate change initiatives. So buildings become much more engaged with entities, with weather authorities, or a Google map to connect maybe individual window settings with or shade settings for windows in the building. So you have, based on the location, based on certain user patterns or demographic patterns, climate change patterns, you connect very well locations to future events. And this is what we do with 3D or 4D modeling today in cities. You do digital twins of cities, and when you look into the data requirements that you need to make these models actually come to life, you need 5G for that. You need to backhaul maybe incident or event level type of data, crowdsourced data for these models. So all these modeling capabilities are quite necessary because cities build on these models their future investments. You talked about many years. Do we need all these parking spaces in the future when we have autonomous cars? Or could there be recreational facilities like we have in Paris alongside of the Seine? So these kind of questions can be answered through the models. Another very exciting technology and approach that cities are taking is about creating that citizen engagement model. Cities like New York, for instance, they're using their Link kiosk to actually start to have a communication portal with visitors, but also with citizens around services that are within the vicinity of that kiosk. So it could be just an information center. It could be also a guidance environment for people that don't speak the language, because you may have a chatbot at the other end that actually translates language or distress, maybe confusion, and so forth, cultural environments. So you see that the technology and the processing that sits behind technology, the data that is becoming very exciting, is a major trigger for all these new service experiences. But that also leads us to the question around data privacy and who has access to the data. So the challenge will be that we also have processing again in place that actually allows us to understand this is a more personalized question that maybe requires some additional authentication, or maybe this is a question that multiple people within the last hour have posed. So this could be crowdsourced and will give a random and more aggregated answer. So this is also, again, intelligence that cities are putting into these systems so they can engage on an interactive level with people.
Lastly, we talked about how 5G will open the door to new data-rich smart city applications.
And you have to backhaul. So 5G has a different spectrum and technology levels. So on the one hand, you will be using certain technologies just to backhaul. So instead of having all these different digital kiosks and you need to backhaul them to fiber, and then maybe you're in the middle of Rome or the middle of Jerusalem, so you cannot dig the fiber, so you can use 5G to actually fast forward that implementation. Or you can actually create new districts, like we see a lot of universities already that are becoming very interested in how to look into data-rich applications, innovation programs, and here you can actually build out and pilot infrastructure fairly quickly. Or you can see it in industrial manufacturing and smart cities, where you actually look into 3D printing and new forms and ways of urban manufacturing, because now you have innovation in place, you have infrastructure in place. So you can see that 5G potentially can trigger and open the doors for new skill development, new GDP development, a whole new characteristics, because now you have the bandwidth to do so.
In closing, let me thank Bettina for sharing her insights on 5G with us, and remind all of you, check out Tech Republic for the latest 5G news. And while you're there, subscribe to our 5G and Mobile Enterprise newsletter.